All right, let's talk about backgrounding. So what I'm doing is I'm just bringing in some um, references for art style, but also pictures of this sort of a 1920s bootleggering sort of thing. So I thought I'd do a background in relationship to that. So what I'm starting with is I've got the proportion of my frame. So I just used the quick drawing of that, and I'm duplicating and pasting it because anytime you start thumbnailing backgrounds, you want to make sure you're at least working pretty close to the aspect ratio. And so what I'm doing is I'm pointing out things that I believe that I want to use, and um, anytime I start with thumbnails, it's partially looking at the actual objects and trying to interpret them, and it's part just manipulating shape. And this is not necessarily these early thumbnail are not necessarily about accuracy or detail. It's more about trying to figure out how to compose the space in an interesting way and to break up the space so that it's visually appealing without really spending as much time thinking about perspective. Your perspective is correct, if you've got good vanishing points, if the volume and form on your objects are drawn well, if the texture makes sense. So this is all just framing out spaces and thinking about graphically, is this visually interesting and appealing? I mean, every once in a while, some perspective might jump in there because the natural sort of progression as you draw, as you get distracted by things and blah blah blah. So, but as much as possible, I'm checking and looking at my references, and I'm trying to glean from it, like what would be interesting and what kind of elements do I want to put in here. And the ultimate goal is to always try to think foreground, middle ground, background, and to create that separation between those levels. And looking at elements that are in your reference, like I don't know technically the names of any of these things, but there's like barrels, and it looks like there's probably a cooking or a gas unit, and then there's like the stove probably where it brews, maybe, I don't know. But I saw those shapes in the pictures, and I thought maybe that'd be cool to figure out how to place those in interesting ways. And I always like the idea of when you're messing around initially in these backgrounds is trying to think about ways that you can frame it in a way that your animators would have like something fun to play with. So if we've got this framework, it means two things: that potentially when you animate it, you may not have to animate the entirety of your characters' bodies when they pass through like some of these strong foreground elements. So if you want to do performances behind that, it's something that to think about. I mean, if you're the one thinking background, mostly you want to be at least at some point in the planning stages in developing your backgrounds, is you always want to think about, do characters need to perform in this space, and what kind of performance would they need to be able to deliver? Because there is a such thing as, when you're designing any sort of space, environment, background, that you always want to be conscious of, if I'm putting in too many elements, am I particularly creating a stage that my animators won't be able to play on? And like, that's a really important thing to think about in the progress of, or in the process of designing your backgrounds, is asking yourself, like, is this eventually going to be 3D? Because then there's a bit more flexibility in there for modification and changing things. But definitely, if your backgrounds are going to be two-dimensional, you really want to get some thought to, I want to make sure that I'm making this potentially reusable, but also that I am providing enough sort of visual chaos. I guess that's a good way of saying it. But enough set dressing, meaning that I'm putting in enough elements to make it look like this is going to be a real tangible space, but not to the effect that I'm overdoing it. and then making it too heavy. So those are some things to think about and consider in the process of doing your background is, really get your reference situated. And then from there, it's just thinking about interesting shapes.